Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking what I honestly think is one of the most beautiful and deeply fascinating stories in all of neuroscience. Spirals, tunnels, honeycombs, and shimmering lattices. You know, whether someone is experiencing the effects of a classic psychedelic like LSD or psilocybin, or dealing with a severe migraine aura, people all over the world report seeing the exact same geometric patterns. So we're going to explore exactly why these universally reported visual patterns happen, and how they actually reveal the hidden architecture of your own mind. It's kind of like the ultimate locked room mystery of the brain. I mean, think about it. If you ask 100 completely different people to describe what they saw under various altered states of consciousness, beneath all their personal, quirky details, an uncanny agreement emerges. Why do totally different people, in completely different circumstances, see the exact same geometric shapes? What's forcing the brain to paint these specific grids and tunnels, and why on earth is it so incredibly consistent? Okay, let's dive into this. To solve this mystery, we actually have to travel way back to the 1920s. A psychologist named Heinrich Klüver began meticulously cataloging the visual experiences of mescaline users. And what he discovered was a real game changer. These shapes aren't just random noise or arbitrary hallucinations. They are highly, highly predictable. Klüver grouped them into 4 distinct categories, which he called form constants. We're talking gratings, lattices, and honeycombs, cobwebs, tunnels, funnels and cones, and spirals. These are mathematically consistent constants that just appear over and over again. So here's our roadmap for this investigation. 1. The universal mystery. 2. The 5H2A switch. 3. The log polar map. 4. The Ermentrout-Cowan model. And 5. Universal wiring of the brain. We're going to walk through the chemistry, the anatomy, and the mathematics to solve this thing. All right, step 1, the 5H2A switch. This is the chemical trigger for those geometric visuals. So classic psychedelics like LSD, DMT, and psilocybin, they actually share one master mechanism. They act as agonists at a very specific serotonin receptor. It's called 5H2A, which sits right on layer 5 pyramidal excitatory neurons in your visual cortex. When the switch gets activated, we get a phenomenon neuroscientists call cortical disinhibition. Basically, it reduces the normal inhibition that keeps your cortical activity in check. It's literally turning down the brain's internal volume control, or taking off the brakes. And without those brakes, the visual cortex begins generating its own spontaneous activity. We know this is the exact mechanism, for sure, because if you give someone a drug that blocks that 5H2A receptor, the visions pretty much vanish. And this brilliantly illustrates what happens next. Think of the visual cortex as an orchestra, usually held to a really tight score by a strict conductor. Psychedelics? Well, they fire the conductor. Once those chemical brakes come off, the musicians, your visual neurons, just begin to play entirely on their own, generating this spontaneous, totally unguided activity. Moving right along to step 2, the log polar retinocortical map. Let's look at how the physical wiring of the brain actually translates those signals. So the neurons are playing on their own, right? But what does that self-playing activity actually look like? Well, your eye isn't wired to your visual cortex like a simple camera taking a perfectly flat photograph. The brain is actually a terrible photographer in that sense. The image on your retina is wildly distorted as it travels into the brain, following a highly precise mathematical rule known as a complex logarithm, or the log polar map. Now, what's really interesting about this visual trick is that because of this mathematical distortion, if your visual cortex spontaneously generates the absolute simplest pattern it can, which is just plain, straight, parallel stripes of brain activity on a flat sheet of neurons, your brain reads those stripes backward through that map. The results? You physically experience those straight parallel lines as spirals, tunnels, funnels, and lattices in your visual field. Stripes in the cortex literally become spirals in the mind. Next up, step 3. The Ermentrout-Cowan model. This is the mathematics of pattern formation, the bridge between the chemistry and the anatomy. Let's move through the timeline and see how this builds. To understand exactly why those parallel stripes form in the first place, we have to look at the mathematical models. In the 1920s, Klüver identified the shapes. Then, by 1979, theoretical neuroscientists Bard Ermentrout and Jack Cowan took the exact same kind of mathematics that Alan Turing used to explain how animals get their spots and stripes, and they applied it directly to visual brainwaves. Decades later, in 2001 and 2002, researchers like Paul Bressloff and Martin Golubitsky extended that model to account for line orientation, basically completing the whole puzzle. So here's the exact progression of that mathematical model. Step 1, as we just talked about, excitation goes up and inhibition drops because of that chemical switch. Step 2, the system goes through what mathematicians call spontaneous symmetry breaking. And step 3, out of completely uniform random noise, the disinhibited cortex naturally and spontaneously self-organizes into regular patterns of stripes and hexagons. And when those stripes are run backward through the retinocortical map, they output exactly Kluver's form constants. The math works out perfectly.
Now, you might be wondering, what about more complicated visions? It's really important to note the difference here. What we've been talking about so far are simple hallucinations, pure geometry, like grids and tunnels. These happen at the earliest visual stop in the brain, an area known as V1. Complex hallucinations, on the other hand, are meaningful, structured scenes, like landscapes or faces. Those require memory, expectation, and input from much higher visual association areas of the brain to organize that raw geometry into something recognizable.
Which brings us to step 4, universal wiring of the brain. Let's zoom out and prove that this geometry is structural, not just chemical.
Because here's the crazy part. You don't even need a chemical switch to see these shapes. First off, neurologically, we can actually measure a signature of the brain setting itself free. These visuals correlate tightly with a measurable drop in 8 to 13 Hz alpha waves. Alpha waves are basically the brain's resting inhibitory gate. When alpha drops, the brain's overall neural entropy, or its complex, unpredictable activity, rises, and intense visual imagery starts to emerge. The brain just slips from a tightly ordered state right into a spontaneous pattern-generating mode. So the crucial point is, consider these completely non-drug-related states. During a migraine aura, your visual cortex is overexcited. In sensory deprivation, it's cut off from normal input. During a near-death experience, it's generating spontaneous activity. In every single one of these states, the visual result is exactly the same, Kluver's form constants. When the visual cortex is left to generate its own activity, it just defaults to these shapes.
And this really summarizes the absolute rigor of these findings. Honestly, it doesn't matter if the trigger is a sensory deprivation tank, a severe migraine aura, a near-death experience, or a chemical switch. The geometry is universal, precisely because the physical wiring of the human eye and brain is universal. The shapes belong strictly to the brain's structural architecture, not to whatever happened to trigger them. And that brings us to the profound realization of this entire explainer. When people describe seeing these swirling, incredible geometric patterns, they aren't just seeing random hallucinatory noise. No way. They are experiencing something incredibly grounded and real. The geometry you see is literally the structure of your visual brain made visible. You are quite literally looking at the hidden mathematical order of your own mind. It's just a gorgeous biological truth. Folded inside just a few pounds of tissue is a mathematical structure so precise that when the brakes are taken off, it paints the exact same honeycombs and spirals for a person back in 1926 as it does for someone today. Which leaves us with one final, awe-inspiring question. What else is hidden in the architectural wiring of your mind, just waiting for the right switch to make it visible? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the incredible machinery of your own perception.